It was one of those rare quiet evenings. I'd had a long week at work, and as I collapsed onto the couch, I could feel the tension finally start to lift from my shoulders. The house was empty, save for me and the dim light of the TV flickering in the background. Emily, my wife, had told me that she had an important project at the office and would be working late. It was nothing out of the ordinary. She'd been doing this for months now, working overtime to meet the demands of her graphic design career. She was talented and driven, and I was proud of her, even if it sometimes meant we spent more nights apart than together. Still, there was a part of me that always wished we had more time together. We both had demanding jobs, and life seemed to get in the way of our attempts to reconnect. In the early days of our relationship, we used to stay up late talking, planning our future. But as time went on, the noise of daily life took over. I could feel the distance creeping in, and it wasn't just about the hours we spent apart. There was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I glanced at the clock. It was already 8:30 p.m. I hadn't heard from Emily yet, which was unusual. She'd always check in if she was going to be late, a simple text or a quick call. But that night, nothing. I shrugged it off at first. She was probably busy, lost in her work, and I didn't want to disturb her. But as the evening wore on, my thoughts began to wander. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my messages, and checked social media. Maybe I was being paranoid, maybe I was overthinking it, but I had to know. I drove to her office. It was only a 10-minute drive, but by the time I arrived, I found myself second-guessing the entire decision. What was I even doing here? It was a simple check-in, just to see if she was still there. No harm in that, right? But as I turned the corner onto the street where her office building was located, I noticed something odd. A few friends had posted updates, nothing of interest. I noticed Emily's phone was sitting on the kitchen counter charging. It was unlike her to leave it behind, especially when she was working late. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up on me. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something felt off. The silence was too heavy, and my mind kept running in circles, imagining all sorts of possibilities. I stood up, pacing around the living room, trying to distract myself. I turned the TV off and walked over to the window, looking out at the street below. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound coming from the rustling of tree branches in the wind. It should have been comforting, but instead, it made the stillness in the house feel even more pronounced. It wasn't that I didn't trust Emily. I did. She was my wife, the woman I had built my life with, the person I shared everything with. But tonight, for some reason, I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way, but tonight, it felt different. My thoughts spiraled. Maybe she had stayed longer at the office than she planned. Maybe a deadline had shifted. Or maybe she had met a colleague for a drink to discuss some project. Rationally, it all made sense. But the doubt lingered like a shadow hanging over me. I decided to call her, but the phone rang for a while before going to voicemail. I frowned, a small knot tightening in my stomach. The voicemail was typical, her voice upbeat as she left her message, but the absence of her answering made me feel uneasy. The silence seemed to stretch on too long, and my mind kept returning to the fact that she hadn't checked in with me. We were married after all. It was rare for us not to touch base at least once during the evening. I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on something else. But no matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, the feeling wouldn't go away. Finally, I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked to the door. I didn't know why, but something inside me told me I needed to check on her. The parking lot was practically empty. Most of the cars in the lot were long gone, and I didn't see Emily's car anywhere. I paused, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. She was always one of the last to leave, and even when she did, she'd usually stay for a while in the parking lot, finishing up emails or making calls. The fact that her car wasn't there was strange. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe she had left early for some reason. I told myself that it wasn't the end of the world, that I should just turn around and go home. But then I thought about the fact that she hadn't called or sent a text. It just didn't add up. So I decided to wait. I parked in a spot far enough away from the building to remain inconspicuous, and sat in my car for a while, staring at the empty lot. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that everything would make sense when Emily walked out of the building, ready to come home. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel more and more uneasy. I was growing impatient. Why wasn't she out here yet? I checked the time on my phone. It was already after 9 p.m., and there was still no sign of her. I figured I'd give it another few minutes. If she didn't show up, I'd call her again. But as I waited, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A figure stepped out of the office building and into the parking lot. I sat up straighter, leaning forward to get a better look. It was Emily. She was walking toward the parking lot, but she wasn't alone. I squinted through the windshield, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Emily was laughing, smiling brightly, her body language easy and relaxed. The person she was with, a man, someone I didn't recognize, was walking beside her. They were talking animatedly, and at one point, Emily reached out and lightly touched his arm. It was a gesture that seemed too intimate for a simple work relationship, too comfortable for coworkers. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just that they were walking together. It was the way they were interacting, the way they seemed so at ease with one another. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was this someone she'd been working with? I didn't know, but there was a feeling deep in my gut that told me this was more than just a professional connection. I wasn't sure what was going on, but something didn't sit right. I should have left. I should have driven away. But instead, I found myself glued to my seat, watching them walk across the parking lot. Emily opened the door to her car, but before she got in, the man said something that made her laugh again, and they exchanged what looked like a brief but warm hug. It wasn't the kind of hug you give a colleague. It was more personal, something that felt like a goodbye between friends, or even something more. They stood there for a few seconds, talking softly, until Emily finally got in her car and drove away. The man lingered for a moment before walking in the opposite direction, disappearing into the night. I felt a mix of emotions, confusion, anger, hurt. I didn't know what to make of it. It was the kind of thing I had never expected to see. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. What had just happened? What did it mean? I couldn't shake the image of Emily and that man, standing so close together, laughing and talking. My mind raced through a million different possibilities, none of which were reassuring. Was I just being paranoid? Had I misinterpreted what I saw? Or was there something more going on than I was ready to admit? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. The night had taken a turn I never expected. I couldn't bring myself to leave the parking lot. It felt like I was in some kind of strange limbo, too unsettled to drive away but too unsure to approach the situation head-on. The image of Emily and that man, so at ease with each other, so natural, kept replaying in my mind like a haunting loop. The more I thought about it, the more questions surfaced. Who was he? Why had she never mentioned him before? And why had she never told me she was meeting someone? I had always prided myself on being the supportive partner. I didn't interfere with her work, didn't question her late nights, trusting her in the work she was doing. But tonight, everything felt different. As I sat there, my mind went in circles. I was no detective. I wasn't trying to catch her in a lie. But the fact that Emily had been so careful not to mention this meeting made my stomach twist. If there was nothing to hide, why not just tell me? Why didn't she say something when she was getting ready to go? Or why hadn't she at least checked in, like she usually did when she stayed late? My thoughts kept spiraling down darker paths. Paths I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. But something inside me pushed me forward, deeper into the fog of suspicion. The clock in my car flashed 9:15 p.m. A whole hour had passed since I had first arrived at the office building. And still, nothing had changed. There had been no sign of Emily returning. The man was gone, and the parking lot was still empty, with only a handful of cars scattered around. The building was quiet now. No lights were on in the office windows. It was clear that the employees had gone home for the night. I glanced down at my phone, hoping for a message or a call from Emily, but there was nothing. The silence of the car was deafening, the weight of my own thoughts pressing in on me. I stared at the road ahead of me, feeling a wave of uncertainty flood over me. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there indefinitely questioning myself. But the next step was unclear. I had already seen something that didn't sit right with me, and now I had to make sense of it. Should I confront her right now? Should I call her? I wasn't sure. The problem with confronting her was that I didn't have enough information. I'd seen her with a man, yes, but I had no idea who he was or what the nature of their relationship was. I could call her and demand an explanation, but that might push her away or make her defensive. The last thing I wanted was to make her feel like I didn't trust her. But how could I not feel suspicious after what I had just witnessed? At that moment I made a decision. I couldn't let the uncertainty eat at me any longer. If I was going to make sense of this, I needed answers. I had to figure out who that man was, and what he meant to Emily. And to do that, I had to get closer to the situation. I wasn't going to confront her tonight. I wasn't ready for that. But I could find out more, piece together the information I had. I took a deep breath and started my car. The engine hummed quietly as I pulled out of the parking lot, carefully avoiding drawing attention to myself. I wasn't exactly proud of what I was about to do. I had always trusted Emily, had always tried to respect her privacy. But tonight, I felt like I had no other choice. The urge to find out what was really going on overwhelmed everything else. The drive to the bistro, the place where Emily and the man had shared their conversation, wasn't far, just a few blocks away. It felt wrong, yet strangely necessary. The streets were quieter now, the usual buzz of traffic having died down for the night. As I approached the bistro, I could feel my heart rate pick up, the anticipation and anxiety mixing together in a tight knot in my chest. The streetlights cast a soft glow over the sidewalk, and I could see the warm, inviting lights of the bistro through the window. I pulled over a little further down the street and parked my car out of sight. I didn't want to be too obvious. I needed to blend in, to be an observer in a situation that didn't feel like my own anymore. The bistro was small and cozy, the kind of place that didn't scream for attention but had an intimate, welcoming feel to it. Through the window, I could see a few people eating dinner, a couple of waiters bustling around, but there was no sign of Emily or the man she had been with. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe they had already left, that I was wasting my time. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to see this through, even if it was uncomfortable. I had to know if my instincts were right. I sat in my car for a while, watching the bistro from a distance. I told myself I wouldn't follow them inside. I wasn't here to spy on her. I just needed to understand what had happened, to make sense of the situation. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the cold air pressing against the windows of the car. I could see people coming and going from the bistro, but there was no sign of Emily or the man. It was starting to feel pointless when, just as I was about to give up, I saw them. There they were, walking down the sidewalk toward the bistro. Emily was talking and laughing with the man, looking every bit like someone enjoying a casual dinner with a friend. They were close, their body language easy and relaxed, their faces lit up by the soft streetlights. My heart sank. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was hard to ignore the way they were interacting. There was a familiarity there, a comfort, that seemed too intimate for a simple work meeting. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I was parked, but I watched as they entered the bistro together. I sat in my car, my hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. The image of them laughing together, of Emily looking so at ease with him, didn't sit right with me. Why hadn't she mentioned him before? Why hadn't she told me about this dinner? I was trying to keep a cool head, but inside a storm was brewing. I wanted to march into that bistro and demand answers, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't give me the clarity I was looking for. I had to remain patient. The only way to figure this out was to wait, to observe, and to gather more information. As I sat there, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was overthinking this. Maybe there was nothing between them. Nothing more than a professional relationship or a casual dinner among colleagues. I had seen Emily with other people before, work partners, clients, but none of those encounters had ever triggered the same feeling inside me. This was different. The way they had looked at each other, the way she had touched his arm. It wasn't the kind of behavior I had seen from her in a professional context. I glanced at the clock. It had been almost an hour since they had entered the bistro. I couldn't sit here forever. The uncertainty was eating at me. The only thing I could do now was wait for them to leave, and hoped that they didn't notice me sitting here like some kind of voyeur. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the bistro. Emily and the man stood at the door, exchanging a few last words. They laughed again, but this time, their goodbye felt different. It was soft, intimate, almost like a farewell between close friends, or something more. Emily hugged him tightly, a gesture that made my stomach twist. I couldn't remember the last time I had received such a hug from her. It felt personal, almost too personal considering the circumstances. I sat frozen in my car, watching them. Emily got into her car, and the man walked in the opposite direction, disappearing down the street. I waited a few minutes before I started my car and followed her. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I felt like I had no choice but to follow the trail. There was too much I didn't know, and the only way to get the answers I needed was to keep going, even if it meant facing something I wasn't ready to see. The drive home was a blur. I had followed her from the bistro, not knowing exactly what I was hoping to find, but there was a sense of unease, a gnawing sensation deep in my gut. The streets had been relatively empty at that time of night, the road almost deserted except for the occasional car passing by. Emily's car, glowing faintly in the distance, was easy to follow. I wasn't sure how far I was willing to go, but I couldn't stop myself from trailing her. She had been so careful tonight, so evasive. The sense of being caught in something larger than myself, a puzzle I couldn't yet solve, was overwhelming. I kept a safe distance, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I tried to focus on the road, to ignore the growing tension in my chest. But with every turn she made, the knot inside me tightened. Was she leading me to some other place? Or was I just overthinking everything? It was hard to tell. My mind was racing, bouncing between confusion, betrayal, and uncertainty. Part of me still wanted to believe that there was a perfectly innocent explanation for what I had seen tonight. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions, maybe she was just having dinner with a colleague, someone she worked with closely and had known for a while. But deep down, another part of me wasn't so sure. The intimacy I had witnessed between Emily and the man at the bistro hadn't seemed like a simple work relationship. It was too comfortable, too familiar. It felt like something more. I knew I had to face whatever was coming, whatever truths lay ahead. The alternative, pretending I hadn't seen anything, was unbearable. The doubt was already there, hovering in the back of my mind, and I knew that if I didn't confront it now, it would continue to eat away at me. But I also knew this wasn't something I could just casually ask her about. If there was something more to the situation than I realized, it was going to be a difficult conversation. As we approached the turn that would take us onto our street, I hesitated. Should I pull into our driveway and wait for her to arrive home? Should I follow her to wherever she was going next? My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, and I could feel my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what I was doing, but I knew that I couldn't just let her walk in the door without knowing what was really going on. I decided to continue following her for a while longer. My mind was filled with a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them comforting. I watched as Emily's car turned into a quiet residential area, the kind of place that didn't seem to fit the mystery that had been building up inside me. This wasn't the route we usually took to get home, and my confusion deepened. I had no idea where she was going. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe she was meeting a friend. Maybe there was an explanation for all of this that I hadn't considered. But as my car followed her, my anxiety grew. I kept telling myself that it would be fine, that I would just ask her when we got home, that there was no reason to overreact. But no matter how many times I told myself this, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Eventually, she pulled into a parking lot. My eyes widened as I realized where we were. It was a small apartment complex, not far from the center of town. I had seen it before, a place that was tucked away behind a small strip of shops. I had never been there before, but I had driven past it often enough to recognize it. It was the kind of place that felt inconspicuous, like it wasn't meant to be noticed. Emily's car slowly rolled into a parking spot, and she came to a stop. I sat there, still parked a short distance away, trying to gather my thoughts. This wasn't what I had expected. Why had she come here? I couldn't help but wonder if this was a place she had been before, a place she hadn't mentioned. The doubts that had been quietly building inside me were now screaming for answers. I couldn't just sit there and wait forever. I had to know what was going on. I had to understand why Emily had kept this from me. As I sat in my car, I felt an overwhelming need to approach her, to walk up to her and demand the truth. But I didn't know how I would do that. I didn't know how I would confront her. What was I supposed to say? I saw you with another man tonight, and now you're here. It sounded absurd, like something out of a movie. But it was reality, and in that moment, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I took a deep breath and slowly got out of the car. I had to know. I had to find out what she was doing, where she was going, and with whom. As I walked across the parking lot, I tried to steady my breathing, tried to convince myself that I wasn't doing something foolish. But deep down, I knew I was stepping into a situation that could change everything. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it, but I didn't have much of a choice. The uncertainty was unbearable. When I reached the entrance to the building, I paused for a moment, unsure of what to do next. I wasn't sure if I should walk in or wait. My pulse was racing. I felt like an intruder in my own life, a stranger in the world I had thought I knew so well. But I couldn't back out now. I had already crossed the line by following her here. The only way forward was to face whatever was waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to walk toward the building's entrance. The lights inside were dim, casting a soft glow on the exterior. There was a quiet stillness in the air. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my shoes as I walked closer to the door. I could see a few people inside, some residents of the building, a couple of neighbors chatting in the lobby. But Emily wasn't among them. I tried to peer through the glass, looking for any sign of her. That's when I saw her. She was walking up the stairs, holding a small bag in her hand. She was with someone else. And it wasn't the man from the bistro. This time, she was walking hand in hand with another man. A different face, but the same casual, familiar way they were interacting. The knot in my stomach tightened even further. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. The shock was so sudden, so overwhelming, that for a moment I couldn't move. The world around me felt unreal. Was this really happening? Was my wife, the woman I had trusted, the woman I had built my life with, now involved with someone else? I stood there frozen, watching as they disappeared into the building. My mind was a blur of thoughts. Angry, confused, hurt. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I had no idea what this meant. Was I seeing things clearly? Was I misinterpreting the situation? Could I have misunderstood everything? I had to know what was going on. I had to confront her, to ask her why she hadn't told me about this. Why had she kept this secret? But I also knew that I couldn't just rush in, not without understanding what I was walking into. I needed to gather my thoughts, to figure out what I was going to say. The walk back to my car felt longer than it should have. My head was spinning. I had to stop and catch my breath before getting into the car. The questions were relentless, pummeling me with their weight. Who was the man with her? How long had this been going on? Was I just oblivious, or had she been hiding this from me for a while? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was certain. The image of Emily walking hand in hand with someone else had changed everything. What had started as a simple question, why hadn't she come home yet, had evolved into a situation I didn't know how to handle. I wasn't sure what I would do next, but I knew one thing. My life, our marriage, could never be the same again. The drive back to our house felt like the longest one of my life. Every turn, every red light, felt like an eternity. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding in my chest. And my thoughts were a whirlpool of confusion and anger. The events of the night were crashing over me, and I couldn't keep up. First, the man at the bistro, and now this another man, someone I didn't know, someone she was walking hand in hand with, leading her into an apartment complex. It didn't make sense. None of it did. I had spent the past few years thinking I knew my wife completely, but now everything was falling apart in front of my eyes. I parked the car in the driveway, not bothering to turn off the engine. I just sat there, staring at the front door of our house. The lights inside were off, a sign that Emily had probably just arrived home. The quiet of the house seemed deafening, mocking me. I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront her, but I knew I couldn't just sit here any longer. The questions that were eating away at me were too loud to ignore. I had to face this, no matter how much it hurt. My mind kept flashing to the image of Emily with that man. The way they had walked into the building together. The way she had smiled at him. It was clear that there was a connection, something more than mere friendship or work acquaintanceship. She hadn't just been with him. She had been comfortable with him. It had felt intimate. It had felt like something I should have known about, something she should have told me. I tried to take deep breaths to calm myself, but it didn't work. My pulse was racing, my chest tight. I kept hearing the echoes of the evening in my mind, the laughter at the bistro, the soft touch on his arm, the closeness that had felt almost like betrayal. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected to find myself here, sitting in the car, dreading the conversation I had to have with my wife. I knew there was no point in delaying it any longer. If I didn't confront her now, it would only eat away at me. I couldn't live with the doubt, the uncertainty. I needed answers, and I had to hear them from her. With a deep breath, I opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night air. The sound of the door closing behind me felt heavy. I walked slowly toward the front door, my steps almost mechanical. When I reached the door, I paused for a moment, steadying myself. This was it. I didn't know what I would find on the other side, but I had to face it. I turned the doorknob and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. The faint sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen was the only noise breaking the silence. I could smell the faint remnants of the dinner I had made earlier. But it felt like everything in the house had changed. It was no longer our home, it was just a place. A place where a marriage had been built, but now felt uncertain, fragile. I walked down the hallway toward the living room, where I knew Emily would be. And there she was, standing by the window, looking out into the dark. She was dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, looking so much like the woman I had married. But something about her tonight was different. There was a distance in her posture, a quietness in her demeanor that I hadn't seen before. She wasn't startled when I entered the room. It was as if she had been expecting me. Her voice was soft when she spoke, almost as if she was trying to avoid the confrontation we both knew was coming. "You're home late," she said, her eyes not quite meeting mine. I stood there for a moment, gathering my thoughts. The words I had rehearsed in my mind seemed to evaporate, leaving only the raw emotion that had been building up inside me all night. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I couldn't tell what she was thinking. Was she going to deny everything? Was she going to lie? I didn't know. But I knew that I couldn't let this go. I needed to know the truth. "What do you mean?" she asked, though I could hear the slight tremor in her voice. I didn't have the energy to dance around it anymore. The questions in my head had turned into a tidal wave, and I was drowning in them. "You weren't at the office. You were at a bistro with another man, laughing, talking like old friends. And then you went to some apartment complex with him. I followed you, Emily. I saw everything." Her face went pale, and she stepped back slightly, as if she had been physically struck. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. It was like she was searching for something to say, something to make sense of what I had just revealed. I didn't give her the chance to explain right away. My emotions were too raw, too frantic to hold back. "Why didn't you tell me about him? Why didn't you tell me where you were going tonight? Who is he? Why are you hiding this from me?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with something, guilt maybe? Or shame. "I wasn't hiding anything," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd understand." "Understand what?" I felt a lump rise in my throat. "That you're meeting other men behind my back? That you've been keeping secrets from me?" Her eyes welled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly, as if she didn't want me to see. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice shaky but steady. "It's not like that. It's just complicated." "Complicated?" I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the otherwise silent room. "Complicated? Emily, we're married. How could you hide something like this from me?" She looked at me, her gaze searching mine, and for a moment, it felt like we were both standing on the edge of something huge, something we couldn't come back from. She opened her mouth to speak, but her words seemed to catch in her throat. Finally she spoke, her voice small but honest. "His name is David. He's someone I've been working with for a while. We've grown close. In ways that I never expected. But it's not what you think. We're not Involved, not like that. I shook my head, not sure what to make of her words. Then why did you go to that apartment complex? Why were you so secretive about it? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I didn't want to hurt you. David is going through a rough time in his personal life. His marriage is falling apart, and he's been a shoulder for me to lean on. I never wanted you to think there was anything more to it. I never meant for it to get this complicated. Emily, my voice caught in my throat. I was struggling to process everything she had just said. It didn't make sense. She had kept this from me, but why? Why hadn't she been honest? I don't understand. If it was just a friendship, why keep it a secret? Because I didn't know how to explain it, she said, her voice filled with regret. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want you to think I was doing something wrong. I thought if I could just keep it quiet, things would stay normal. But I was wrong. The room felt smaller now. The weight of her words, the heaviness of the silence that had followed, made it hard to breathe. I stood there, unsure of how to move forward. My mind was still reeling from everything she had said. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that there was nothing more to this, that this was just a misunderstanding. But the truth was, I didn't know what to believe anymore. I need some time to think, I said, finally, my voice hoarse. I can't just process all of this in one conversation. I don't know what to think right now. Emily nodded, tears falling freely now, but she didn't try to stop me. She didn't try to explain further. She just stood there, quietly watching as I walked out of the room. I went upstairs, my mind swirling with thoughts and emotions that I couldn't sort through. I didn't know where to go from here. Didn't know what my next step would be. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my life, had been shaken to its core. And as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I realized that the most painful part of all of this wasn't just the secrets or the lies. It was the fact that I didn't know who I was anymore, who we were. The person I had known and trusted, the woman I had married, was someone different. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. I didn't know how to move forward from this moment. And the hardest part was realizing that I might not ever know.